So how are you doing? It's PAX. How many people have been to a PAX before? Coming back, feel like coming home. All right,
nice.
so a lot of you, but not everyone. Who's here for the first time at PAX? That's
Welcome.
awesome. Welcome. I hope you're having a great time so far. We've been coming to PAX and giving talks for almost 10 years at this point, which is really humbling, but also, I hope, a testament to how special this community is. And indeed, that's a bit of what we hope to get to in our talk today. So really hope, especially for those of you who are first-timers, that you make the most out of it, and you also reflect not just on the awesome games, but the broader community and just how this maybe informs your relationship with games, more generally speaking. We're so happy that on a Friday of PAX, you would take an hour during lunchtime, no less, to be hanging out with us. That's really cool. We take that really seriously, so thank you for that. We're going to do our best to make it worth your time. Let me introduce us to you. I'm Aaron Suduko. This is my dear friend and colleague, Dan Hughes. We are video game analysts for a little online publication by the name of With a Terrible Fate. Any chance anyone has heard of us before? It's okay if you okay, right on, a few.
Awesome.
That's awesome. As I said, PAX West in particular has a really special place in our heart, and we love the opportunity to come back. So seeing familiar faces in the crowd is always especially special to us. So thank you for that. But for those who don't know, we are dedicated as a publication just to working to analyze and better understand and appreciate the storytelling of video games. That's the one thing we do because we truly believe that these stories are not just distinctively valuable as narratives, but also that they can inform our understanding of ourselves, our communities, what it is to act beyond the boundaries of those games. We've been up to that for a decade in long-form written content, which you can find on withaterriblefate.com, podcasts, wherever you like to listen, convention lectures such as this, live-streamed adventures through games, studying them in a book club manner on Twitch, and similar sorts of
Interpretive dance.
What's that?
Interpretive dance.
Yeah, you know, anything you can think of. And if you can think of something that we don't do, just tell us, and we will try to find a way to do it. What are we up to today? Well, a lot of our talks focus on basically trying to make sense of a particular aspect of our own gaming experience that's puzzling to us, that we want to try to unravel so that we can better locate why it is that it matters to us and hopefully put it to better use in our further gaming adventures, whatever they may be. And so this is going to be a talk very much like that comes out of some experiences that we've been having over the last few years as we've been getting a little older as gamers. Certainly not the oldest gamers at PAX West, which is humbling and gratifying and makes us feel good, but we're starting to see some gray hairs. Maybe some of you are starting to see some gray hairs. We're seeing younger people at PAX, which is exciting, but makes us realize that we're no longer the younger people at PAX. And it turns out video game series are growing up with us. If you're an older gamer, you hopefully have had the benefit, the honor of growing up alongside these long-running series of games where new ones come out every few years and you're able to pick them up and play them and sort of locate who you are at the time as a person and as someone who has particular interests in games in line with that given moment in that series' history. So we've been happening upon that quite a lot, and then earlier this year we happened upon it in a certain way with a certain game, didn't we, Dan?
Yeah, so Elden Ring Nightreign came out, and we're big fans of Dark Souls and the Soulsborne series, and you played all of it.
Yeah, and then it occurred to me, actually, most of our friendship consists in talking about the games we play, but come to think of it, we never actually talked about your experience with Nightreign.
No, because I played it for about 10 minutes and decided I really didn't have a fun time with it, so I put it down and never came back to it.
And why was it that you put it down for that reason, not having a good time with it?
It just didn't speak to me as a Soulsborne kind of game, and I thought, I think I'll probably come back to this, and that moment never came.
And so this is the experience that we want to home in on in this panel. And before that, just a little bit of housekeeping so that we can understand how this is going to go. In these talks, what we love to do is share with you, as I said, how we're thinking about particular experiences in gaming and why they matter for the full hour. But the reason that we do this and keep coming back and why we love PAX so much is to have conversations, because artwork is conversation with other people who are interested in these particular objects that you are as well. So we really want to talk to you all about this. The Q&A won't be in the room, so if you do want to have those sorts of conversations with us, we're just going to ask that you give us a moment to clear out at the end of the talk, and then we'll meet up just past the elevators. We've been told there's some nice empty space so that we can leave the room open for the next people presenting and make life easy for the enforcers. Why don't we give the enforcers a round of applause, by the way? They rock. None of this would be possible without them. Let's shout that out very appropriately. Something else, just so you know, I am very anal about spoilers in games and artwork myself. So in case that's something you're concerned about, we're going to be talking about the Final Fantasy series, the Legend of Zelda series, maybe a little bit about Hollow Knight, Darksiders, Okami. I think in terms of the generic understanding of spoilers, really Zelda is where you want to watch out for things, and we'll be diving into a little depth about Tears of the Kingdom. So no offense taken if you want to leave and preserve your naive perspective on those games for your first experiences, just so you know. But we had a particular experience with Nightreign, as we were saying, and we wanted to take a step back and think about why that was. Quite generally, because we think this happens with more than just Nightreign and Soulsborne games, but we started out thinking about this puzzle. How do we relate our appreciation of a game to our appreciation of its series? Because the thought for me was something like this. You know, I played through all of Nightreign, like Dan was saying, and I felt that I could appreciate what it was doing. It was an experience that was coherent. I could get into it. At the end of the day, I felt like I had, done something of value in the game, and yet, in the back of my mind, it just didn't feel quite like a Soulsborne game, like you were saying, Dan. And then I think when we have these, I'm sorry, my clicker is not cooperating. This is why. Okay, there we go. We may or may not experience little ticks like that throughout the presentation. But it's very easy once you have an experience like that against the backdrop of a series that you feel you understand quite well to jump from that experience of the game to an evaluative judgment, saying this feels like a good game, but it's not a real Soulsborne game. How many people thinking about series in general are familiar or have been in a conversation where someone's arguing about whether something is a real member of the series? That's not a real, okay, good, this is great. Our hope in creating this was like, yes, this is a very general experience that we want to try to pin down and make more useful. So I'm glad that right off the bat, we can relate to it. So our thought here was, first, it's just important to try to understand this generally, but something else interesting. Like I said, we've been growing up with these series, seeing them evolve around us, and interestingly, especially if you think there's some objective standard according to which a game is a real member of a series or not, opinions can kind of change on that over time. So we are old enough to have played Dark Souls 2 when it first came out. Some who are familiar with the series might remember sort of the cultural lore around this. When we played it around the time of Dark Souls 3 being out, we're like, oh man, that's not a real Dark Souls game. It's doing something that's interesting, but it's too much off the beaten path of the rest of the series. Someone other than Miyazaki did it. I like it, but it doesn't feel like a Soulsborne game. Therefore, it's not a real Soulsborne game. And then something funny happened. More games in the series came out, and Elden Ring came out, some other stuff came out, and now we are among the increasing number of fans who feel like Dark Souls 2 is paradigmatic of what the series is up to. So we have this feeling that this phenomenon here, but something about player sentiment has to do with it. It changes over time, but surely time alone isn't the thing that explains why our judgments here change. So what is it? What does it mean for something to be good on its own terms as a game, and what does it mean for it to be good as a member of a series? By the way, as I was suggesting, this is not going to be relitigating the Dark Souls series or Soulsborne more generally, so if those aren't your jam, that's fine. We're not even going to spoil stuff about them. The suggestion is that, again, this is a quite general phenomenon, so I think you can run the exact same argument that we just made for how some people feel about Tears of the Kingdom. It's a really interesting playground and game to work through, but maybe it doesn't feel like a Zelda game, and therefore maybe it isn't a real Zelda game, and let's get into arguments about that. And by the way, the same stuff that we said about Dark Souls 2, you could apply to the changing communal perspective on the Wind Waker over time. I see some nodding, so this is good. We have some people who are old enough to live through this, like we were. So here's the thought. We want to understand what it is to evaluate a game that is a member of a broader series. We'd better figure out first what it takes for the game to count as a member of the series. And now you might be thinking, okay, I see you trying to motivate this like big philosophical move to pick this apart, but it's really freaking easy to tell what's a member of a series. Why are you doing this to me? We don't need this. But it turns out this is one of those interesting questions where the more you try to pin down what it takes for something to be a member of the series, the more the obvious answers kind of fall apart in your hands. So you might think like, well, it's just a bunch of stuff that comes from the same creator. But a lot of these long-running series, like Zelda or indeed Soulsborne, like I pointed out with Dark Souls 2, change hands in terms of who's responsible for them over time, and indeed that's part of what makes them interesting. You might even think like, well, hey, this is obvious. Look for the same words in the title, like The Legend of Zelda before some subtitle. That'll do it. But it turns out a lot of things that we want to count as members of a series, like if you like Soulsborne games, A lot of people are inclined to think Elden Ring is a Soulsborne game, not an obvious connection with just the mere name there. And I have bad news for me if I decide to design a Legend of Zelda fanfic game. Just calling it The Legend of Zelda Aaron's Amazing Fanfic is not going to make members of the community recognize that as a member of the Legend of Zelda series. And indeed, not even having a single authorizing entity like a company say, yes, this is going to be a game in the series is going to work, because anyone who's familiar with the Zelda series, if you're a real fan, remembers what happened with the CDI games. And if you don't know the CDI games, it's because they were authorized by Nintendo and then later uniformly disavowed by fans and creators alike in the Zelda series. So I take that to be motivation for us to look for less obvious answers to what series membership consists in, to try to figure out why it is that we value these things and how it is we relate particular entries to them. What we're going to do in this talk is give you basically two toolkits for how you can think about that. One which centers the meaning of player self-expression in what it is to identify games in a series quite foundationally, and the other that centers what it is to understand games as this kind of historical artifact where the creation of them is itself a story that you can relate to in different ways. And then we're going to step back and suggest that maybe, just maybe, these alternate toolkits are useful ways of moving forward in more productive, positive conversations about games of the sort I hope you have many during PAX West and similar cons like this in the future, especially if this is your first time. So, I'm up first. This is my toolkit. What I'm going to suggest to you, giving away the ending right off the bat, is that in a deep sense, the most basic understanding of what it is for a game to be a member of a series is you as a particular player choosing to engage with it as something that is like your engagement with other things of that kind, which is to say you get to decide what it is that something is a series for you. And I'm a philosopher, if this isn't obvious by now. One of the things that we do in philosophy that's really helpful is if we're trying to pin down the nature of a phenomenon that's hard to wrap our arms around, not sure how to answer the question at hand, we can look to nearby phenomena or more general phenomena to try to get a handle on some firmer intuitions to then figure out how to unpack the case differently. And it turns out that a lot of what we're already thinking about and care quite a bit about with respect to video game series we can see more clearly when we think of series more generally in the abstract. So I'm going to ask you, if you will, to step away from video games with me for a moment. I know it's PAX, video games are great, but just for a moment, we'll come back. But just think about my throwing stuff up here on the screen like this, and you don't have mics, so don't worry, you're not on the spot, but Dan has a mic. So I'm going to trap him and make him part of this thought experiment. So Dan, you can see the screen. There's a screen here, so you can't say, oh, yeah, I can't see the screen.
Send help.
Suppose I have this stuff projected before you. What counts as a continuation of this series?
Looking at these, I would say another blue shape.
How many people would say blue shapes? So this is important, right? This is illustrative in and of itself. Some people raise their hands. Not everyone raised their hands. That's kind of interesting, right? We're used to, as gamers, thinking that there's this fact of the matter about what it is to be a member of a series, but we already have this disagreement about a very abstract case of the kind you would expect out of a math class or something, where there should be a right answer. Why is there not a right answer? Well, notice, we need a sense first to even be able to approach this question of what defines the series as it stands. We need a sense, but it's not obvious that there's some singular sense that pins that down. What I want to suggest very roughly is that, like I said quite pointedly, what I've done is just shown you some stuff projected up there on the screen. In order for you to understand it as a series, in the first place, you have to have some way in your mind of partitioning that stuff into objects that are related to one another in a certain way, which is to say, in a sense that is abstract but will hopefully become more applicable when we move back to video games, you need what I'm going to call some kind of interpretive principle, a principle of coherence that explains why certain parts of that stuff glom together into these particular wholes, these objects that we can understand and relate to in some sense that explains how we take one object to be like another and therefore part of a broader series. Call that a principle of coherence. Saying that something is a blue shape is to identify such a principle of coherence, and so then something is an object and a member of this series just in case it's a blue shape. But notice, again, no guarantee that that's what you land on. So here's an alternative. Now, Dan is not in the hot seat. I've trapped these other made-up people in my thought experiment, so woe betide them. Johanna would have had that same intuition. Yeah, she says blue shapes, but notice, it's perfectly plausible that someone like Johann might come along and say, hey, I see shapes with just a certain number of sides. And so I'm noticing that as I go from left to right, they're increasing in side length by 1 each time. And that might seem like just another way of saying the same thing. It is demonstrably not, because it's going to lead to incompatible verdicts on what counts as an extension of that series. So notice, if I throw up a red hexagon, Johann, by dint of how he's making sense of those objects, is going to say, hell yeah, we got another member of that series. I love that series. I'm a fan of that series. Give me more of that series of shapes. Johann's not going to be that way. But the opposite is going to be true if I throw up a blue circle. Johanna's like, heck yeah, new entry in the series. Johann says no. By the way, as with all great creative enterprises, I am just cribbing things from someone who has come before me, because this is one of the lessons that I take from the 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein's commentary on what it is to follow a rule. The thought is that when we're identifying things as members of a series and extending them, there's no further court of appeal, if you like, or standard according to which we can say someone like Johanna is right in how she makes sense of the series and not Johann. So let me read this out. I promise it'll be helpful and come back to video games. Suppose that a rule, like what counts as an extension of the series, intimates to me how I'm to follow it. That is, as my eyes travel along the line, like the line of these shapes, an inner voice tells me, draw this way to extend the series. I won't be able to teach anyone else my technique of following the line unless, indeed, I teach him some way of listening, some kind of receptivity. But then, of course, I can't expect him to follow the line in the same way as I do. Now, one of the lessons is what we just saw. You can't expect to settle on the same principle of coherence that explains these objects in series membership as someone else. But another principle is going to help us pivot back to video games. This thought that maybe there is a way in which I can understand what it means for me to be receptive to one particular principle of coherence that explains how I interact with these objects rather than another. Maybe not anything deep when it comes to geometric shapes, but maybe if we think about video games as these narrative, thematically loaded systems of things that we can do, maybe there are ways of appealing to facts about our action or agency that can help us understand how it ties up with our value and the reasons why we play these games. So that's the hope. Dan, I got heady. How am I doing?
Great. It's all good.
Okay.
So I do have a question. So
yeah.
I'm with you on the coherence idea. So we've got these series. We've got Johann, Johanna, blue shapes all the way. But I do want to see this kind of applied to video games, because let's say like Johann has an idea of a series,
right.
And he's saying, well, I see a video game from a very particular point of view, and this is how I've come to understand what this series means to me. Let's kind of dive into that.
It's a good idea. And since you're Team Johanna, let's subject poor Johann, because no one loves Johann, to further thought experiments. He continues to be trapped in my slides. But things are going to get better for him, because we get to expose him to games called The Legend of Zelda for the first time. And now I'm going to add a pedantic note, because again, what is at issue is what it takes for something to be a member of a series. So I might gloss this as talking about Legend of Zelda games in order to build up the argument here. You should hear that as games that have the words The Legend of Zelda in their title. But with that in mind, let's suppose we give Johann his first Zelda game, Ocarina of Time. He sits down and plays it. Let's just ask, what does it take for Johann to make sense of his experience there? Quite generally understood, back to the level of just stuff that Johann sees, or in this case, practically experiences. Well, I want to suggest he's still going to have to appeal to coherence, some kind of way of making sense of what he's doing as interacting with something, with this game. And there's a clue. There might be many ways of making sense with that particular box or cartridge, whatever. Insofar as what Johann is doing is playing a game, we have some rules for what counts as a principle of coherence. If you think that there are some things that just have to be true of a game, like there's got to be a goal, there's something that he's working towards, something that he aims to achieve, and notice what I just baked in there already, there's a player, and insofar as someone is a player of a game, if what Johan's really doing and experiencing this as an object is playing a game, then it had better come out that whatever it is he's doing in relation to it, it's all explicable in terms of aiming towards that goal. That's what it is to play a game. So this is a thought that we have some guardrails now on what it is for Johan to not interpret the game in a narrative sense even, but just to make sense of what he's doing as some coherent experience and relation between him and an object. But now I want to bolt on a little bit of narrative content to that. This is optional because remember, there are many ways to play games, and many people have a lot of fun and find a lot of value in games beyond just their stories. We care about the storytelling of games. So let's spot us the assumption that Johan is like us, interested in making sense of the story. It's still going to be a game. So those guardrails we put in place of there being a goal and Johan acting in pursuit of that goal, those all still hold, but we want to suggest that further, since it's a game that tells a story, the goal corresponds with the conclusion of the story. And so it had better be the case that there's a narratively coherent explanation for everything that Johan is doing in relating to the game. So at any time he's picking up the controller and doing something that counts as engaging with the Ocarina of Time, he can explain in a coherent, consistent way what that contribution amounts to such that it's advancing the narrative. That still gives Johan a lot of interpretive freedom, like we saw with the broader series example of the shapes, but it gives him kind of a method for making sense of his activity in the game as he goes through it. And as with a lot of philosophical concepts, this is easiest to see when you notice some friction where it's not working. So let's examine a case of dissonance. Suppose Johan's working through the game. Probably even people who haven't played The Legend of Zelda understand that Link is the hero who's associated with courage, right? So suppose Johan gets that. He says, okay, yeah, I get that. What I'm doing is like piloting this particular character, and he seems to be really courageous. Maybe the explanation of my activity in the game is that I'm guiding along this pure embodiment of courage. He's the bearer of this thing called the Triforce of Courage, and that can explain why he stands up to these immeasurable threats for little kids, like a giant dinosaur living in a mountain and making life really hard for the inhabitants, those poor Gorons. But then suppose Johan gets a little further in the game and he discovers these iconic enemies called the Re-Dead. And it turns out that the canonical thing that Re-Deads do is paralyze Link with fear when they shriek at him if they notice him. And now we have this apparent dissonance between how Johan's understanding his activity in the game, unifying it under this principle of coherence, and what's happening at this moment. Because if Link is an embodiment of courage, it's just inconsistent that he would be paralyzed by fear, by anything. Now, here's a choice point we're going to come back to at the end. Johan might say, I know what the game is about. This disagrees with what the game is about. Therefore, the game is bad. What we want to suggest is that since we're building up this understanding of the game from Johan's interpretation of what it is that he's doing, you should instead take a different stance and say, okay, I thought I had a sense of how I was involving myself in this game. This is keying me into the fact that maybe that's not the right way to understand it. So maybe I need to massage my interpretation a little bit and try to reclaim coherence. Here's one way of doing that. Maybe he can look at Link not as the manifestation of courage itself, but as this ordinary boy. And Johan's power as the player is that he's something like the spirit of courage, where everything that he does is animating this kid with the courage to do things that other people can't. And if Link is just a normal boy, it's trivial that he's going to be imperfectly receptive to courage. Sometimes it'll work out. Sometimes Johan tries to do things, control Link in the game, and Link does them right away. But sometimes when things are really scary, like the Re-Dead, maybe courage won't be able to reach Link. And how fitting that that's represented in the game by Johan literally not being able to move Link because Link is paralyzed. The control falls out. And so Johan reclaims coherence. Go through the game and suppose that Johan comes out with this overall coherent explanation of what it is for him to involve himself in a player with it. My suggestion with player relativity is then if Johan picks up a further game, say some of these other Zelda games, works through it and finds that the same principle of coherence applies, where he says, yeah, actually it makes sense of everything I'm doing in the game. Here too, if I understand myself as the spirit of courage animating an ordinary kid, that's all it is to call a game a member of the Legend of Zelda series relative to Johan. Because again, there's no deep truth about what it is for Johan to pick that principle rather than another one to explain his activity in the game. But indeed, there's no deeper truth on this reading of what it is for a game to be a member of a series at all, because it's built out of how we understand our own activity in games, as advertised. So now he can have an explanation of what it is for something to count as a Zelda game for him. Let's suppose he runs into the friction that we foregrounded with Tears of the Kingdom. I am a fan of Tears of the Kingdom, I think, on net, but I will suggest this is loosely framed around my first experience with it when it came out. So say that he experiences this tension, not unlike the tension he experienced inside Ocarina of Time with the Re-Dead, saying, okay, you know, I get what this game is about, I think, like I can appreciate what it's doing, it's fun to pick up and play, maybe I can't even put it down, but there's just something. I don't know what it is, but it doesn't feel quite like a Zelda game. How can Johan unpack that? And again, easy to write that game off and say, flawed because it says it's Zelda, and it's not, as the alternative path in Ocarina of Time suggested. But what I want to suggest is instead, Johan can undergo this method that allows him to proceed from that uncomfortable feeling to actually better understanding why he cares about The Legend of Zelda in the first place, and further, what Tears of the Kingdom has to do with that. So let me walk you through that. It's 4 steps. The first step, very obvious, if he feels like there's this tension between the Tears of the Kingdom game and the other games that he recognizes as Legend of Zelda games, locate what it is in Tears of the Kingdom that's doing that. Let's suppose that the source of it is the building mechanics, where he feels like, oh, you know, like I get that people really appreciate how you can build just anything in this world, but something about that just doesn't feel Zelda to me. Okay, we have a target for what it is that we're trying to explain. How is that not like the other Zelda games? So now, Johan has to turn back to the games that he does recognize as Zelda and say, okay, why is it that this particular aspect of Tears of the Kingdom is conflicting with it? Even after he has a principle of coherence that explains membership in the Zelda series, I want to suggest, it may just be the case that he never thought critically about how something like the tools of the game are related to that principle of coherence. And so say now this invites him to think about it for the first time. So, oh, you know, come to think of it, it seems like all the tools that Link has in other Zelda games are something like keys to obvious locks, where as soon as I get a new tool in a dungeon, say the hook shot for those who are in the know, immediately everything clicks into place in terms of how it is that I'm supposed to use that to solve puzzles and make progress. I see, you know, circular metal thing mounted on the wall or the ceiling, and I know what to do, and there's one way to do it, and it's using this tool. In contrast, the tools of Tears of the Kingdom are much more freeform, focused on creating a bunch of different things, noticing novel puzzles, and figuring out cool and interesting ways to solve them, as all of the great content on YouTube, for instance, will attest to. That seems like a difference that you can track and that marks it apart from the other games in the series, but now there's this further question. That's not enough, because Johan is explaining membership in terms of his principle of coherence. He has to say, okay, why is that a difference that matters to me in understanding these games? So go back to Johan's principle of coherence, and suppose that this invites him to elaborate it and say, okay, yeah, you know, I hadn't thought about tools before in relation to this, but maybe it's not just that I'm giving Link the courage to do things. Maybe what's important to me is that I'm giving him the courage to do the obvious thing. Everyone in the world can recognize the sorts of things that need to be solved in order to make the world better. Maybe that's something that's represented by these puzzles having something like obvious solutions. But Link alone has the courage to do that, and I can help him do that by picking up the tools and just doing it. And that's really cool. Maybe you can even think it's cool in the explanatory sense of saying why it is that after you get through the game and get Link through doing all of these various obvious tasks, everyone else in the world gets inspired to become their own hero, living by his example. That seems really neat, and we can see Johan appreciating that for the first time because of thinking through Tears of the Kingdom. So already he's getting a different understanding in kind of how it is that he understands membership in the Zelda series. Great, but that's not the end of the story, because like I said, this all emerges from how it is Johan makes sense of his actions. And that means that Johan has this choice, a deep choice, in terms of how to litigate membership in the Zelda series in light of this new information. And it's a point about series generally, as I started out with. Once he recognizes how it is that the new member conflicts with his interpretation that's defining membership in a series, he can either decide that he wants to stick by that interpretation and say, yeah, you know, like, I feel like I can put myself behind this particular way of understanding shapes, even though that's very low stakes. Or perhaps something that's higher stakes to us at PAX, what it is to engage with a series like The Legend of Zelda. Or he can feel inspired by the differences in this new object to undertake a revision in his interpretation and say, okay, actually, I want to now have a principle of interpretation, a principle of coherence that welcomes in this new member and changes how it is that I engage with games such that they're a member of this series. He can do that in the shapes case perfectly well, either sticking by the side understanding or revising it to thinking about something like, okay, yeah, it's blue geometric shapes. Now there are 4 things up there, and they're all of a piece with the series. And more to the point, he can do it with the Legend of Zelda series, either sticking by this revised interpretation of his principle of coherence that I suggested, giving Link the courage to do the obvious thing, or he can decide, you know, actually, I feel like Tears of the Kingdom gives me reason to think about what I'm doing in these games differently and take something different out of the meaning of my actions in them. I can notice something like, for instance, another property of Tears of the Kingdom, Zelda's not there. And speaking as someone who spent a large part of his life thinking about Majora's Mask, I can tell you she's even there in a deeper sense that she's not there in Majora's Mask. Because, and this is where the spoilery stuff comes in, part of the conceit of Tears of the Kingdom is that to give Link the opportunity to do the stuff he needs to save the world, Zelda, in a time long since gone, sacrificed her rational capacity to contribute to the efforts to defeat Ganondorf at all by turning into a dragon and giving Link the space later on to have a chance of setting things right. So Zelda and her rational influence are not there in this world. Why might that make a difference? Well, you might think, for something like seeing something as an obvious problem with an obvious solution, you don't just need the courage to solve it, you need wisdom to understand the relationship between a puzzle and what it is that you need to do to dissolve the puzzle. If Johann then says, okay, so maybe what I'm doing is not giving Link the courage to do the obvious thing, I'm giving Link the courage in conjunction with wisdom to guide him along and do what needs to be done, then suddenly Tears of the Kingdom can be welcomed into the fold. These other games, Zelda in one way or another is present, and since wisdom is there, it makes sense that these puzzles would be presented to Link as having obvious solutions by dint of the tools that he has available to him, and all he needs from you, the player, is the courage. On the other hand, Zelda's no longer there, still have the courage, but you gotta figure out what the puzzles are yourself, and you and Link gotta do your best to figure it out. And you might think that illustrates in a nice way how it is that the free-formness of Tears of the Kingdom actually adds another flavor to the series that is nonetheless coherent with what has come before. But this is the crucial thing. As we said in the case of shapes, there's no further court of appeal or rule or norm or however you want to call it that says which of these choices Johann ought to make or which is better. It's just up to how it is that he wants to make sense of his involvement with games that he takes to be characteristically Legend of Zelda. And this is what I really like about this idea, especially nowadays in series where not only are the series long-running, but we have the good fortune of creators coming into the gaming fold and being inspired by other games. We have notions of things like a Zelda-like, or games that are relevantly similar to series. And indeed, if you go on Reddit, you'll find a lot of people saying, hey, you know, I like these games. Is there anything that feels like them? Like, I want to play more games like this, but there aren't any other games with these titles. Can you tell me, like, what are some cases? And it can feel really squishy and weird to figure out, from your own point of view as a gamer, your practical standpoint, what it is for a further game to count in the relevant sense as a member of that series for you, which can make it hard to invest yourself in a game that might be nominally referred to as something like a Zelda-like, but where you don't really know, will it count as a Zelda-like for me? Now suddenly, we have a better explanatory base for what it is, not just for something to be Zelda-like simpliciter, but for it to be Zelda-like relative to Johann, where whichever way he goes with that principle of coherence, once he's got it, he can extend his Zelda series just in the same way he did when he was playing other games that had the words The Legend of Zelda in the title. So it might come out that other games popularly referred to as Zelda-like in one way or another satisfy that condition for Johann. Maybe he picks up something like Darksiders or Hollow Knight. Who's excited for the fact that Silksong is finally coming out? Oh my God, it's like Christmas came early, and that's putting it lightly.
After 7 years.
So excited, maybe
The
also
long
bitter.
Christmas.
So maybe something like Johann guiding the Knight through Hollow Nest, or indeed War through this Khan to blame him for the apocalypse feels like giving an avatar the courage to do the thing that is obvious and anyone should be doing but no one is. And by virtue of this understanding of series membership, that is exactly what it takes to qualify those games as the Legend of Zelda games relative to Johan. That's all it takes. That's not sort of a term of art. And some Zelda-like games that people might call Zelda-like will definitively fall outside the series. So if Johan stays with his interpretation of giving Link the courage to do the obvious thing, Tears of the Kingdom will just definitively not be a Zelda game for him. That's all that takes. But also maybe something like Okami, lauded as one of the most Zelda-like games in recent history, and a game that I love personally, by the way, might not seem like a case where you're giving the avatar the courage to do the obvious thing, because you might think that's a really tortured and inconsistent way of describing what you're doing when you're piloting the avatar dog of the goddess of the sun, I suggest. Now, hopefully that's something that can give Johan a better appreciation of what it is that he's up to in these games and the value that he recognizes with it. Hopefully it's also a method that you can take home and appreciate where you might find yourself thinking about turning away from games or even moments in games that feel dissonant with your appreciation of the games. I suggest that the moments in which you find yourself doing that can actually be those that are ripest for elaborating your appreciation for these series and what it is that you're actually doing with them in the first place, such that you recognize this value and put so much of your time into them. By the way, you might still hope, and I'm going to double back for one moment because my clicker was misbehaving. You might still hope at the end of all this that the method might be something that vindicates some absolute conception of what it is to call something a member of the series. I suggest, and this will tee up what Dan is thinking about, that you can still do this, but the force of it is going to be different. So if I'm talking about the Legend of Zelda series simpliciter, which is just to say not indexed to any particular player, maybe what I'm interested in is not my experience with the game, which is covered by the player relative meaning, but something more like the history of how the artifacts were brought about, the artifacts of those particular works of art, and how it is that people have engaged with them generally over the years. And to that point about general engagement, if you want to think about some sort of abstract object like the series in and of itself, you might think, well, one way to do that on the player relative meaning is just to sum all of our different player relative series and look at how it is that they relate to each other. Because you might still want there to be some special role for the words The Legend of Zelda, or more to the point, the character Link or something, in your understanding of what the Legend of Zelda series is. You might say, well, one way to actually have better conversations with each other on that basis is to just look at games that feature Link or have the words The Legend of Zelda in their name as a starting point, and then look at all of those different player relative series that spawn off of our engagements with those first games. Because in that kind of situation, we can still talk about the games and adjudicate our different experiences with them, but the understanding is that that general understanding is necessarily built out of our individual playthroughs and conceptions of our activity within those games, which means that there's just no coherent way of expressing your understanding of the games that lords that understanding over others as some kind of objective prescriptive value of the games. Rather, your expression of the value that you found in them is just an invitation for someone else to share with you their player relative series and what it is they recognized in it, which may, all the same, invite you to revise your interpretation of the series or discover some new value in it. So that's the thought, that's the hope, and the method is simply notice that tension. Look at where the tension is coming from, figure out why it's in tension with the elements of what you take to be the series, and then step back and think, well, how is it that I'm making sense of the meaning and value of my actions so that these are coherent activities of mine across hundreds or even thousands of hours? How might I revise or think about that more critically to more consciously and deeply engage with these games and find further value within them? What do you think, Dan?
Well, I want to talk about Final Fantasy, so
okay.
That's what I'm going to do. So
I don't know how to take that.
Well, you should take it well because you've teed me up beautifully, specifically. So Aaron and I have been doing these panels for a very long time now. He mentioned up top about 10 years, right? So often when we put these together, I worry that when I come up with my section of the slides, they won't cohere or indeed cohese to what he's talking about. But today, when he mentioned Johan and his experience with Tears of the Kingdom, I thought, oh, that's me, but with Final Fantasy 13 specifically. So you can see this real picture of me in my stand up there. This is my experience for the past 15 years with the video game Final Fantasy 13. I really don't like it. And you might, and that's fine, and I'm going to get back to that, but I have had a really fraught history with this game because I love Final Fantasy as a series. I love pretty much every title in it, bar this one. And this is a problem for me because it really sticks in my craw for a number of reasons that I'm going to discuss with you here today because the doors are locked and you can't leave now. So here are my problems with Final Fantasy 13 that I've struggled with over the past decade and a half, while I could have been having a child or something. So first, to me, the story of Final Fantasy 13 feels almost like a parody of Final Fantasy stories. Not so much in that it's making fun of Final Fantasy, but in that it feels very rushed. The story feels like it's taking kind of terms and ideas and just kind of barreling through them in a way that feels like it's not doing justice to its own story. It feels melodramatic in that sense, and the characters, to me, feel very one note if they have a note at all. I think that I want to be very clear about something. RPGs are very linear. I think we need to address this. I'm tired of people saying that RPGs are linear as if that's a bad thing. They are. Let's just all agree with that. They have choices in them sometimes, and that's awesome, but they're linear. Come on now. So that said, I think that Final Fantasy 13 is linear in a way that feels kind of boxy and trapping. And I'm seeing some nods, so I'm glad I don't feel crazy in that regard. And it's the first time a Final Fantasy game has ever made me say, this doesn't feel like Final Fantasy to me. It has some of the trappings of it, but it's making me, it feels sour when I play it. There's something wrong with it, and every time I would play it or think about it, I would come back to that thought, and that really bothered me. Not because I had such negative feelings towards Final Fantasy 13, but because I have such positive feelings towards the series, and it bothered me that I had this reaction towards a game that existed within that oeuvre, right? So I looked inward, and I thought, okay, there are all of these issues that I have, but if I keep coming back to this question of this doesn't feel like Final Fantasy, I wanted to ask myself, well, what do I mean when I say that, right? What is this question? These things that Aaron was talking about with Johan, this cohesion problem, what is it that I mean? What do we mean when we say this doesn't feel like a part of a series? And so I spent a great deal of time, I'm not going to tell you the exact amount of time because I don't know that, but I wanted to develop a system for understanding the series, Final Fantasy, through my own lens, right? I didn't set out to solve it, definitively for everybody, just for myself. And I wanted to come up with criteria from each game that I thought represented what the series as a whole was. So narrative themes, character tropes, perspectives that the creators would come at it with, and different foci that those creators came to. And what I really realized over doing kind of years of this, playing through the games over and over again and kind of developing this, is that what I found really rewarding about going through the Final Fantasy series was that I really appreciated how the creative teams changed over time and how the different creators were approaching these stories and kind of putting themselves into it. And so what I was really asking myself when I said what makes me or us say this isn't an X game is I was asking, like, what makes it a X game in the first place, right? Like, why am I saying this is a Final Fantasy game versus this doesn't feel like a Final Fantasy game? So I'm going to warn you, I've done a lot of thinking about this. I'm not going to do it all here in front of you today.
You said you weren't going to say how long you've spent on it.
Well, listen.
I mean, thousands of years you've been talking with me about this.
In my own mind, it's been, we've talked a lot about mind prisons in this presentation, strangely. So in my own mind prison, it's been so many years. But yeah, genuinely, I mean, since Final Fantasy 13 came out, so what was that, like 09 something?
Thousands of years.
Yeah, we're very old. But I do want to say, if you would like to hear my very intense thoughts on this, go to our site, seek me out. I do have lots of thoughts, but I'm going to give you a condensed version. Specifically, I call it kind of the Final Fantasy Ages theory. So I came up with this just kind of thinking about it in terms of comic books, right? How do we look at comic books since they've been around for so long? And often, I'm sure everybody's heard of like different comic book ages, right? The Golden Age, the Silver Age, things like this, right? I'm seeing a lot of nods.
Yeah, and maybe you can help me though, because all
Yeah.
I know about comic books I've learned from you. So and I never
In my
quite know
ramblings.
which properties are being tracked by which ages. So
Sure.
what should I have in my mind for each of these?
So there's a few caveats I want to go through. One, when you hear the Golden Age, the Silver Age, things like this, it's not often done in terms of valuation. It's not like saying the old stuff is the best stuff. This is, especially for my purposes here today, what I want to say is that it's more of a time frame for when creators were involved with certain things, right? So when I talk about the Golden Age of Final Fantasy, I'm particularly talking about when it was the original creators who were talking about Final Fantasy and setting up foundational tropes and things that the series would then talk about in the future, right? So Final Fantasy 1 through 6, I consider to be the Golden Age, where everybody was working on it, who started with it for the most part. 7 through 12, I consider the Silver Age, where creative teams were starting to shuffle a little bit, but things were also changing. They were starting to look at the tropes that were set up in that kind of foundational era and starting to question them a little bit, right? They were starting to play with them and change them and kind of expand and see where they could take those things. And a lot of really interesting things came out of that time. The Bronze Age is where tropes become a little comfortable and technical aesthetics start to really become a focus here. We'll get into that. And then, because you can see, I've kind of given the game away, Final Fantasy 13 and 15. I did say this isn't a value judgment, but it's coincidence, okay? So Final Fantasy 7 Remake to the present, I would call the Renaissance, and I think, you know, when you're talking about comic books especially, there's a lot of different Renaissance periods and things like that. But for Final Fantasy specifically, I would say this is kind of, it's anyone's ball game, right? A lot of interesting things are happening for those of us who are playing Final Fantasy now, especially in Final Fantasy 14. Things are kind of going bananas. But same in the mainline games, right? Things are taking really interesting turns, and it's really down to who's in charge of the creative teams. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about them in depth, just to kind of give you an idea. Final Fantasy 1 through 6, from the creator's perspective, right? This is where things started. So when I say the Golden Age, I think about the original creative teams, and of course there's many people who made up these teams, but I think about these big names, right? Like Amano Yoshitaka, who created these beautiful pieces of art that you see on the screen, these incredible drawings and kind of watercolors that are an art style all his own that eventually just became the look of Final Fantasy. If you've seen these pieces of art or things like this, or if you've played Magic the Gathering and seen cards like this, this style of artwork is very much the Final Fantasy aesthetic. Uematsu Nobuo and his music, beautiful orchestrations that set leitmotifs for years to come in the Final Fantasy series. He orchestrated these beautiful pieces that were then brought into chiptune and 8-bit music to fit on the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super Nintendo and all of that. And then Sakaguchi Hironobu. So for those of you who don't know, the reason it's called Final Fantasy is because Square, I see some people smiling, because Square at the time was going to go bankrupt if they didn't have a hit. So the powers that be went to Sakaguchi and his team and said, make something successful or we will not have money. And so Final Fantasy was born. And so to me, this is a time of these big ideas, huge thematic, grand romantic ideas. Romantic not in the sense of love, but in this kind of, you know, romance, big emotions, bombast, right? These huge things that needed to literally save a company, but bore out these incredible ideas. Moving into the Silver Age, we see that the aesthetic changes are kind of moving with the software. 3D enters in, graphical changes come up, Square becomes Squaresoft, becomes Square Enix. They kind of become known for this graphical rendering. They're the industry standard for a lot of it. The orchestral scoring of Uematsu becomes actual orchestral scoring. CDs can fit it instead of just becoming MIDI and chiptune and stuff like that. Questionable localization in Final Fantasy VII especially, but then that moves over into full voice acting on Final Fantasy X. Listen to my story. That's the very amazing first line of that game. And the scope continues to be grand and continues to be romantic, but changes from these huge ideas into kind of personal philosophy, right? Religious ideas, personal stories, father and son dynamics, lots of different important kind of personal ideas, nihilism, all of these great things that are kind of being teased out of the original ideas that were being explored in those first few games. Now, this is the point that I am going to remind you that I do not like Final Fantasy XIII. And it's because at this time, I start to have problems with these games, right? And I want to be very clear. This is an amazing time for Final Fantasy in a lot of ways. Aesthetically, beautiful. These games are amazing to look at. The graphical rendering is amazing. The gameplay is very fun. A lot of the old guard creative team has retired, gone on to other things. They're no longer at Square Enix. Things are changing hands. The games are changing. The priorities are changing. That's why I refer to this as the Bronze Age. Things are kind of simmering, right? I also feel that narrative focus is changing quite a bit. It's not so much on the romantic bombast of the old days. It's kind of taking a backseat to the aesthetic, kind of technical showcases that are happening. That said, the exception that kind of proves the rule, to me anyway, is Final Fantasy XIV, which at this time is having a catastrophic destruction and then a meteoric re-rise. And it plays to both the nostalgic people who love the old Final Fantasy games and is doing incredible new things, right? So it's a weird time for Final Fantasy, but the mainline games seem to be taking a back seat to a lot of different experimentation that the creative teams are doing. And then we have Final Fantasy VII Remake to the present with 16 and the expansions that have come later in 14. Just really interesting stuff going on here for anybody who's kept up with these games. The most important, I think, that I want to really touch on, Final Fantasy is being made by people who grew up playing Final Fantasy. That's cool, right? It's old enough that that's happening. Just like comic books are being written by people who have only grown up reading comic books and seeing comic book movies. It's a really interesting world to be in that Final Fantasy is that old. So, with all of that being said, I did all this work. I looked into all of these creators. I looked into the history of Final Fantasy. Do I like Final Fantasy XIII? No, I don't. I still don't. But I appreciate it more. I really do. I want to be honest with you. I still really don't like this series of games for a lot of personal reasons that I'm sure somebody will come up to me afterwards to talk about. That's fine. And listen, I want to be very clear. Everybody has a first Final Fantasy game. And this might have been yours.
It was mine, actually.
It was Aaron's. I will never take that away from you. I will never say that you are wrong for liking this game, right? That is not my point in being up here. I desperately wanted to like this. And so I did all of this work to do it. And I appreciate it now, right? Because I know what happened to get to this point. And I think that's really the point in me telling you all of this, right? I developed this whole schema to try to figure out what's going on here. And to me, that's really valuable, that I can talk to somebody about it. And I know more about this game than I ever would have if I just said that I hated it, right? So that's, and I think that at the end of the day, I want to kind of talk about this last thing here, which is I made this comparison to comic books. And I want to say Superman turns 87 years old this year. Final Fantasy turns 38. So we're talking about long-running series. I like Superman. I've not read all of Superman. And if you say that you have, you're lying to me. But you might like Superman, right? I like Final Fantasy a lot. I've played most of it, but I haven't played all of it, right? On a long enough timeline, series are going to be good and bad, right? And there's going to be things that you like and don't like. Now, that might seem like a long way for me to get to that realization, that there's some stuff I don't like, but I really grew a deeper appreciation for this thing that I love by doing all of that. And I think that it's really valuable to take the time to do that, especially if you're sticking with something in your craw for 15 years, like, God, I really don't like that thing. Why do I keep thinking about it, right? So with that, I invite you to do this with anything that you like to.
And so in our last few minutes, let's take a step back, and we want to, frankly, just wish you well onto the rest of your journey through PAX and hopefully beyond that by thinking more generally about these two pillars that we suggest undergird how it is that we've been thinking about the practice of evaluating different games and their relationship with underlying series. Because we think that approached in useful ways that focus what it is that you're trying to get out of them and discovering new things to get out of them with other gamers, this can be some of the best involvement that you can have with these games, and indeed justify why we don't just commit so much of our time, but really put so much of our identities behind these practical works of art. And it's useful, I think, before we get into those pillars of charity and conversation, to have a comparison class to what it is that we're doing. And I'll say, as Dan was saying, hedging his remarks on 13, Game Informer was formative for me. I can still dig up my old physical copies of those magazines that had so much love for games. So this is not a dig at the franchise of Game Informer in general, but I think it really is illustrative. As I looked up in preparing for this panel examples of articles talking about evaluating different series. This came right up for Zelda. Look at the title, Ranking Every Legend of Zelda Game. So that's how this analysis of the series is presented. You go 2 paragraphs in and find out, turns out, by the author's lights, not every member of the series, as you might understand it, is going to be presented, just something that the author refers to as the core members of the series. Leave it as an exercise to the viewer at this point, for all we've said, to think about what core membership of a series, according to this author, consists in. And then you get to the 3rd paragraph, and you find out that one of the things that the author hopes you get out of this is a sense of which of these games are worth playing. So this is a presentation of the series as something that is objective, that the author has an authoritative standpoint on, and that by coming to understand this person's authoritative standpoint, you can discover whether you will find value in these games. And I suggest that in some manner, that's at the heart of a lot of the friction that we can cause ourselves and one another in talking about games. Those moments when you can kind of feel yourself unmoored, because I don't know if you've ever had this with your friends or people in chat rooms, but oftentimes this weird thing can happen to me where I'm talking with someone who likes the same series as I do about these games, and then you sort of make something that feels like a social faux pas, where you say something about why they're really exciting to you, and kind of the other person doesn't just disagree with you or have a different standpoint on the series, but it's like you've kind of undercut everything that they recognize as worth considering in the series. And if you think that there's some objective basis for what it is that you're recognizing in the series beyond your activity in it, it can be really easy to not just lose friends or interlocutors through this, but to cut off conversations with the people who are most invested in the same things that you are. That seems like a pretty bad result. And so we want to suggest, as you go forth and think about your further gaming adventures and what you're up to at PAX, these 2 other principles to hold in your mind. One is charity. It's at the heart of all good philosophy, it turns out, and I think probably all good interpersonal relationships. And one way of thinking about it in this practical mode of engagement with games that we've presented is really just locating the best version possible of something that you're engaging with before you decide how you feel about it. In the case of a game, supposing that it's telling a story and trying to make a certain meaning out of what it's presenting to you, where part of what it's presenting are your own actions, you might think, hey, it's worth my time to find the best possible expression this game has to offer of the meaning of all the time that I put into it before I decide how I feel about it. And only once I have a sense of what it's coherently saying about what I'm up to, can I then decide, okay, in the best lights I can put this game and what I did in, how do I feel about that? And maybe it's still okay to decide with some games, I can appreciate, I can understand what it's trying to say about my actions, not my favorite thing. But if we turn away from a game every time we experience something that we just trigger finger call ludonarrative dissonance, or something that's just, a game unrelated to the series that we love with a Zelda skin on it or something, we just won't make any progress towards recognizing the value in these things that we clearly value so much.
And the other part is conversation, right? Because as much as I joked about kind of turning inwardly and looking at all of these Final Fantasy games, I love talking about it with everybody, right? And I think that the best part of doing that is gaining a deeper appreciation for why other people like other things. So it's a really important part to not keep that a secret and say, hey, this is why I like this thing, and try to kind of get the other person in on it, because that only just deepens your appreciation for it.
And so PAX old heads like us know this already, but newbies, as a way of welcoming you as we close this panel, take our word for it, and then don't take our word for it, go and see for yourselves. One of the really cool things about not just video game cons, but PAX West in particular, is that I really believe when it comes to the community that comes here time after time, part of why it is they do it and why it's worth coming back is that these two pillars undergird everything that we're up to as we play these demos, find new gamers, discover new games, and discover new games to play and value to locate in our favorite games already. So go and enjoy that. Go and have a great time at PAX, no matter how long you're here. And we hope that you found some value in this panel as well, and that you can go and do likewise in your further gaming journeys. Thank you, everybody. Have a great time. If you would like to chat with us, we're just going to take a few minutes to pack up here and go out to clear the room. Find us making our way to the other side of the elevators for some free space. But thank you. Please have a great PAX.